to Sir Maurice Hankey, Secretary of the British Committee of Imperial Defence. That committee built a power-driven, bulletproof, tracked vehicle that could destroy enemy guns. 36, 38, 129 Hankey persuaded the War Office, which was lukewarm to the idea, to make a trial on the 17th of February 1915 with a Holt tractor, but a Caterpillar bogged down in the mud. The project was abandoned, and the War Office gave up investigations. 6, 25, 38, 129 In May 1915, the War Office made new tests on a trench crossing machine, the Triton Trench Crosser. The machine was equipped with large tractor wheels, 8 feet, 2.4 m, in diameter, and carried girders on an endless chain which were lowered above a trench so that the back wheels could roll over it. The machine would then drag the girder behind untilled flat terrain, so that it could reverse over them and set them back in place in front of the vehicle. The machine proved much too cumbersome and was abandoned. 6, 143 144. Little Willie design. December 1915, when Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, learned of the armoured tractor idea, he reignited investigation of the idea of using the Holt tractor. The Royal Navy and the Landship Committee, established on the 20th of February 1915, 39, at last agreed to sponsor experiments and tests of armoured tractors as a type of land ship. In March, Churchill ordered the building of 18 experimental land ships, 12 using Diplock P rails, an idea promoted by Murray Sueter, and 6 using large wheels, the idea of Thomas Gerard Heathericto. 6, 25 Construction however failed to move forward, as the wheels seemed impractical after a wooden mock-up was realized. Few wheels were initially planned to be 40 feet in diameter, but turned out to be still too big and too fragile at 15 feet. 6, 26 27 The ped rails also met with industrial problems. 40, and the system was deemed too large, too complicated and underpowered. 6, 26 Instead of choosing to use the Holt tractor, the British government chose to involve a British agricultural machinery firm, Foster and Sons, whose managing director and designer was Sir William Triton. 35. After all these projects failed by June 1915, ideas of grandiose land ships were abandoned, and a decision was taken to make an attempt with U.S. Bullock creeping grip Caterpillar tracks, by connecting 2 of them together to obtain an articulated chassis deemed necessary for maneuvering. Experiments failed in tests made in July 1915. 6, 25 Another experiment was conducted with an American Killing straight track tractor. A wire-cutting mechanism was successfully fitted, but the trench crossing capability of the vehicle proved insufficient. A Delaunay Belleville armored car body was fitted, making the Killing straight armored tractor the first armored tracked vehicle, but the project was abandoned as it turned out to be a blind alley, unable to fulfill all-terrain warfare requirements. 6, 25 After these experiments, the committee decided to build a smaller experimental land ship, equivalent to one-half the articulated version, and using lengthened us-made Bullock creeping grip Caterpillar tracks. 6, 27, 41 This new experimental machine was called the No. 1 Lincoln machine. Construction started on the 11th of August 1915, with the first trials starting on the 10th of September 1915. 6, 26 These trials failed however because of unsatisfactory tracks. 42 Development continued with new, re-engineered tracks designed by William Triton. 42, and the machine now renamed Little Willie, 43, was completed in December 1915 and tested on the 3rd of December 1915. Trench crossing ability was deemed insufficient however, and Walter Gordon Wilson developed a rhomboidal design. 43. which became known as His Majesty's Landship Centipede and later Mother. 43. The first of Big Willie types of true tanks. After completion on the 29th of January, 1916, very successful trials were made and an order was placed by the War Office for 100 units to be used on the Western Front in France. 37, 590, 38, 129 on the 12th of February 1916. 44, and a second order for 50 additional units was placed in April 1916. 45. France started studying Caterpillar continuous tracks from January 1915, and actual tests started in May 1915. 46. 2 months earlier than the Little Willie experiments. At the Swain experiment, France tested an armored tracked tank prototype. The same month Little Willie was completed. 29. Ultimately, however, the British were the first to put tanks on the battlefield. At the Battle of the Somme in September 1916. The name tank was introduced in December 1915 as a security measure and has been adopted in many languages. William Tritton stated that when the prototypes were under construction from August 1915, they were deliberately falsely described in order to conceal their true purpose. 47. In the workshop, the paperwork described them as water carriers supposedly for use on the Mesopotamian front. In conversation, the workers referred to them as water tanks or, simply, tanks. In October, the Landships Committee decided, for security purposes, to change its own name to something less descriptive. 48. One of the members, Ernest Swinton, 49, suggested tank and the committee agreed. The name tank was used in official documents and common parlance from then on, and the Landships Committee was renamed the Tank Supply Committee. This is sometimes confused with the labeling of the first production tanks, ordered in February 1916, with a caption in Russian. It translated as "with care to Petrograd," probably again inspired by the workers at Foster's, some of whom believed the machines to be snowplows meant for Russia, and was introduced from the 15th of May 1916. The committee was happy to perpetuate this misconception since it might also mislead the Germans. 50. The naval background of the tank's development also explains such nautical tank terms as hatch, hull, bow and ports. The great secrecy surrounding tank development, coupled with the skepticism of infantry commanders, often meant that infantry at first had little training to cooperate with tanks. Russian development. Russian Vezdekh tank prototype 1915. The Tsar tank Vasily Mendeleev, an engineer in a shipyard, worked privately on a design of a super heavy tank from 1911 to 1915. It was a heavily armored 170-ton tracked vehicle armed with one 120mm naval gun. The design envisioned many innovations that became standard features of a modern battle tank. Protection of the vehicle was well thought out. The gun included automatic loading mechanism, pneumatic suspension allowed adjusting of clearance, some critical systems were duplicated, transportation by railroad was possible via locomotive or with adapter wheels. However, the cost would have been almost as much as that of a submarine, and it was never built. 51. 52. The Vezdekh was a small cross-country vehicle designed by Aero engineer Alexander Porokhovchikov that ran on a single wider upper track propelled by a 10 HP engine. 2 small wheels either side were provided for steering, but while the vehicles could cross ground well, its steering was ineffectual. In post-revolution Russia, the Vezdekh was portrayed in propaganda as the first tank. The Tsar tank, also known as the Lebedenko tank after its designer, was a tricycle design vehicle on 9mm high front wheels. It was expected that such large wheels would be able to cross any obstacle, but because of a flawed design most of the weight was forced through the smaller rear wheel, which became stuck when tested in 1915. The designers were prepared to fit larger engines, but the project and vehicle was abandoned. German development. The A-7V was the only German tank of World War I that saw actual combat. A prototype was built in early 1917 for trials, with production of the vehicles beginning in October of the same year. They were used on about 6 occasions from March 1918. Only 20 were produced. 53. Germany also had several other projects on paper as well as other prototype tanks in development. Operational use in World War I. A British Mark I tank in action on 26 September 1916, moving left to right. Photo by Ernest Brooks. An A-7V tank at Roye on 21 March 1918. Char Renault Foot, Les Invalides. The first offensive using tanks took place on the 15th of September 1916 during the Battle of the Somme. 49 of the Mark I type were committed, of which 32 were mechanically fit to take part in the advance and achieved some small, local successes. 54, 1,153 in July 1917, 216 British tanks were employed in the Third Battle of Ypres but found it almost impossible to operate in the muddy conditions and achieved little. Not until the 20th of November 1917, at Cambrai, did the British Tank Corps get the conditions it needed for success. Over 400 tanks penetrated almost 6 miles on a 7-mile wide front. However, success was not complete because the infantry failed to deploy and secure the tank's gains, and almost all the territory gained was recaptured by the Germans. The Australian, Canadian and British forces then scored a far more significant victory the following year, on the 8th of August 1918, with 600 tanks in the Battle of Amiens. General Erich Ludendorff referred to that date as the Black Day of the German Army. Parallel to the British development, France designed its own tanks. The first two, the medium Schneider CA and heavy Saint-Chamond, were not well conceived, though produced in larger numbers and showing technical innovations, the latter using an electromechanical transmission and a long 75mm gun. Both types saw action on numerous occasions but suffered consistently high losses. In 1918, the Renault Foot light tank was the first tank in history with a modern configuration, a revolving turret on top and an engine compartment at the rear. It would be the most numerous tank of the war. A last development was the Super Heavy Char 2C, the largest tank ever to see service. Some years after the armistice. The German response to the Cambrai assault was to develop its own armored program. Soon the massive A-7V appeared. The A-7V was a clumsy monster, weighing 30 tons and with a crew of 18. By the end of the war, only 20 had been built. Although other tanks were on the drawing board, material shortages limited the German Tank Corps to these A-7Vs and about 36 captured Mark IVs. The A-7V would be involved in the first tank versus tank battle of the war on the 24th of April, 1918 at the Second Battle of Villers-Bretonneux, a battle in which there was no clear winner. Numerous mechanical failures and the inability of the British and French to mount any sustained drives in early tank actions cast doubt on their usefulness, and by 1918, tanks were extremely vulnerable unless accompanied by infantry and ground attack aircraft, both of which worked to locate and suppress anti-tank defenses. But General John J. Pershing, Commander-in-Chief, American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, requested in September 1917 that 600 heavy and 1,200 light tanks be produced in the United States. When General Pershing assumed command of the American Expeditionary Force and went to France, he took Lieutenant Colonel George Patton, who became interested in tanks. They were then unwieldy, unreliable, and unproved instruments of warfare, and there was much doubt whether they had any function and value at all on the battlefield. Against the advice of most of his friends, Patton chose to go into the newly formed U.S. Tank Corps. He was the first officer so assigned. The first American-produced heavy tank was the 43.5-ton Mark 8, sometimes known as the Liberty, a U.S.-British development of the successful British heavy tank design, intended to equip the Allied forces. Armed with two 6-pounder cannons and 5 rifle-caliber machine guns, it was operated by an 11-man crew, and had a maximum speed of 6.5 miles per hour and a range of 50 miles. Because of production difficulties, only test vehicles were completed before the war ended. The American-built 6.5-ton M1917 light tank was a close copy of the French Renault Foot. It had a maximum speed of 5.5 miles per hour and could travel 30 miles on its 30-gallon fuel capacity. Again, because of production delays, none were completed in time to see action. In the summer of 1918, a 3-ton, 2-man tank, Ford 3-ton M1918, originated by the Ford Motor Company, was designed. It was powered by two Ford Model T, 4-cylinder engines, armed with a 30-inch machine gun, and had a maximum speed of 8 miles per hour. It was considered unsatisfactory as a fighting vehicle but to have possible value in other battlefield roles. An order was placed for 15,000, but only 15 were completed, and none saw service in the war. American tank units first entered combat on the 12th of September, 1918 against the St. Mihiel salient with the 1st Army. They belonged to the 344th and 345th Light Tank Battalions, elements of the 304th Tank Brigade, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Patton, under whom they had trained at the Tank Center in Bourg, France, and were equipped with the Renault Foot, supplied by France. Although mud, lack of fuel, and mechanical failure caused many tanks to stall in the German trenches, the attack succeeded and much valuable experience was gained. By the armistice of the 11th of November, 1918, the AEF was critically short of tanks, as no Merchant-made ones were completed in time for use in combat. Interwar period. Vickers medium Mark is on a maneuver somewhere in England. 1930. After World War I, General Erich Ludendorff of the German High Command praised the Allied tanks as being a principal factor in Germany's defeat. The Germans had been too late in recognizing the value to consider them in their own plans. Even if their already hard-pressed industry could have produced them in quantity, fuel was in very short supply. Of the total of 90 tanks fielded by the Germans during 1918, 75 had been captured from the Allies. The US tank units fought so briefly and were so fragmented during the war, and the number of tanks available to them was so limited, that there was practically no opportunity to develop tactics for their large-scale employment. Nonetheless, their work was sufficiently impressive to imbue at least a few military leaders with the idea that the use of tanks in mass was the most likely principal role of armor in the future. Highlights of U.S. Army appraisal for the development and use of tanks, developed from combat experience, were 1. The need for a tank with more power, fewer mechanical failures, heavier armor, longer operating range, and better ventilation. 2. The need for combined training of tanks with other combat arms, especially the infantry. 3. The need for improved means of communication and of methods for determining and maintaining directions, and 4. The need for an improved supply system, especially for petrol and ammunition. At the war's end, the main role of the tank was considered to be that of close support for the infantry. Although the tank of World War I was slow, clumsy, unwieldy, difficult to control, and mechanically unreliable, its value as a combat weapon had been clearly proven. But, despite the lessons of World War I, the combat arms were most reluctant to accept a separate and independent role for armor and continued to struggle among themselves over the proper use of tanks. At the outset, thought of the tank as an auxiliary tow and a part of the infantry was the predominant opinion, although a few leaders contended that an independent tank arm should be retained. In addition to the light and heavy categories of American-produced tanks of World War I, a third classification, the medium, began receiving attention in 1919.